Hi, everyone. I am here with David Frederick. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I have to say that I had so much fun preparing this interpretation of, you call this Dr. What?
Dr. What?
Dr. What?
Yes.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I was a big Doctor Who fan, and I find this really fun to work with. Um, I just want to do a brief introduction to everyone about David Frederick. David Frederick and I have overlapping pasts. David's father worked for ARP Instruments, among other keyboard companies. And there's pictures of him that you can see in front of a ARP 2600. How old were you at that time?
I was probably about 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really
Yeah.
cute.
I grew up teething on them, you know?
Yeah. That's great. So you've been playing them almost literally all your life.
Literally all my life.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's awesome. So you grew up in electronic music, and you sort of graduated to a film and television composer career. You worked for Discovery, National Geographic, CBS, DIY, PBS, a really impressive roster of
Thank you.
channels, yeah. And you've also done a lot of sound effects using Sony equipment, Akai, Suzuki, Bond, just to name a few, Yamaha. So you know a lot about audio. This is a really exciting experience to have our first masterclass, or I should say mini masterclass.
Yeah,
So
it's
welcome.
exciting. It's exciting. It's always a great opportunity to share, some of your ideas and your experience. I mean, everybody's experience and journey is different. So hopefully I can bring a unique perspective to our conversation.
So tell us a little bit more about what you do for people that may not know about the patch book and everything like that.
Yeah, well, I'm a composer for film and television. That's my main thing. I also do a lot of sound design work. Um, Going back a while, obviously did a lot of sample and sound design work for other manufacturers. I also do sound design for cinematic work. So that's kind of a side stuff that's available kind of through my signature series. Sounds, samples, patch books, the ARP 2600 patch book, which has been really, really neat to see the renewed interest in that stuff. But I spend most of my time during my days scoring for film and television now.
That's really cool. So I am going to be helping you. I'm going to be your assistant today. You're going to be doing more of a workshop. So far, we've had some studio tours, but we're going to go into a little bit more of the how, which is pretty exciting because we're all about education and trying to help people discover new things. So tell us a little bit about the presentation you're going to do today.
Sure. So I think what I wanted to do is share my experience in how I use analog synthesizers and in particular the 2600 in my work as a composer. It's interesting, and if you can pull up the my perspective on the 2600 in modern music,
Sure.
I can talk a little bit about that. So as a composer, I live in two worlds. I spend most of my time as a composer, but I'm also a keyboard player. So when I look at this and approach this as a composer, generally speaking, I think about how do I want to use the 2600 as an instrument. It's more than just sample and hold and R2D2 type sounds, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as an instrument, it has a tremendous breadth and depth that I think if you get to know it, you can do some really cool things with it. Mm-hmm. It's an endless source of inspiration to me. And I know other composers who use the 2600, feel the same way. So from a perspective standpoint, I look at the 2600 in two ways. Do I want it to be a prominent instrument in my cue or my track, as a film composer, TV, and anyone that's out there? We refer to music as cues. So if you hear me say that, that's just a habit, but it just means a track or a piece of music. So when I think about creating a cue, I think about, do I want the 2600 to be prominent? Do I want it to be a featured instrument? Or do I want it to be very subtle and maybe add depth to something? Or do I want it to double? So it's a matter of perspective on how I want to use the instrument. The other thing that I look at too is, don't limit yourself as a composer, as a musician. Don't be lazy. There's some really cool things you can do. And again, you don't have to be the world's greatest programmer, but if you have a general understanding of what filters do, what oscillators do, what an ADSR is, you can actually do some really cool things. I always joke, it's more than flashing lights and patch cords. To me, the 2600 is more than impressing social media and girls. I see all the pictures, and I'm guilty of it too. I've been there. I probably have a box somewhere that's got pictures of me with all the lights flashing. And look, it's cool, I get it, but look, this thing is actually a really cool instrument. Creatively, diversify and enhance your sounds. I'm really big on what I call a sonic palette. So for me, the more tones I have to work with, I think the more creative my music is. Mm-hmm. So when I think about how to differentiate as a composer, the 2600 plays a key role in that. As a film composer, there's millions of film composers out there, and everybody either sounds like everybody or there's few that sound really unique. So in my case, I try to use the 2600 to differentiate myself, to create a unique sound that enables me to perhaps stand out over other composers and their work. And I also look at it from creating unique sounds. You can use it for everything from the traditional analog bass, leads, to some really interesting applications, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then from a practical standpoint, again, my perspective, I love using the 2600 to be able to fatten up my orchestral samples, add some depth to a sound, or take orchestral cues to a new level. And again, it doesn't have to be overt where it's in your face, but it's a really good practical tool if you know how to use it. So what I'd like to do is kind of taking all of this, looking at that perspective, I want to give you a couple of examples.
Sure.
I whipped up musical ideas that demonstrate a little bit about what we're talking about. So what I'd like to do is talk about this first example, which I call action drama cue. Okay. So if you can just bring that up, I'll talk about this for a second.
Sure.
So in this case, I created just a quick action drama cue. And the objective here is for the 2600 to be a little more overt in the cue. I wanted to use the 2600 to add some movement, a little bit of an electronic groove, maybe some more drama and some more action suspense. Now, the orchestral part could probably live on its own, but I really felt like the 2600 could bring what I was looking to do, the groove, a little more drama, a little more action. Gotcha. So the first thing you're going to hear is the orchestra and just one 2600. All right. So you'll hear orchestral percussion, you're going to hear sampled percussion, you're going to hear brass ensemble, string ensemble, and then just one sequence 2600. If we could listen to that real quick, we'll talk about the next phase after we hear.
Sure. Okay, great.
So again, in and of itself, it probably works fine, but I wanted to take it to the next level. So what we're going to hear next is just the 2600 mix. So what I've got going on here is a couple of sequenced patterns. One of my favorite sounds is this kind of LFO type droning sound where the LFO modulates one of the oscillators and does some really cool stuff. It's processed with some outboard gear. But it'll give you a sense of just what the 2600 tracks sound like within the cue. So let's take a listen to that, and then we'll talk about it.
Oh, wow, I love that. That really thick, beefy sound.
Yeah, so it definitely creates rhythm, creates groove, and adds a little bit of that kind of drama to it. So when we put that together with the orchestral side, I'd like to think it brings the whole track together. And again, our objective was to add movement, a little bit of an electronic groove, and some action and suspense. So if we could listen to that, Dina, that'd be great.
Okay.
So again, very simple example of using the 2600 to, add that prominence to that cue. But what I really like about the 2600 is how well it blends with orchestral type sounds. For me, it's one of my go-to instruments when I want that analog sound in the cue. Again, there's one example, a lot prominent, sits in front of the mix, has a lot of movement, a lot of things going on. So what I'd like to do now is give you a different example where it's much more subtle. So let's take a look at our use case number 2, where I created a cue with a very familiar motif. And essentially what I wanted to do was use the 2600 to fatten up my string samples. And the reason why is anyone that has used, string sample, any type of orchestral sample, they're kind of binary. They kind of work with very limited programming. You get what you get, you sample it, you model it, you maybe edit it, but at the end of the day, it's still a static sample. So one way that I've kind of, through my experience, has kind of enhanced those samples is I've used analog synthesizers, in particular the 2600, to kind of make them breathe a little bit more. And this is a very, very subtle way to bring, I guess, a little more life to an orchestral sample. And what you need to think about, or what I think about as a composer, is if I'm working with live strings or a string ensemble, and you've got a bunch of musicians, even though they're all playing the same cue and the same notes and the same parts, they're human beings, and there's minute differences in how they perform that piece of music or that melody line. And that's what makes live instruments sound so amazing. And that's where samples, start to fall short, obviously. So a way that I've gotten around that to just add a little bit of subtle depth and movement to these orchestral samples is by utilizing like the 2600 or other analog synthesizers, and I layer them with those. So in this case, I wanted to fatten up and add depth to my string samples, and I wanted them to breathe. And the way I made them breathe was essentially detuning the oscillators, which is a favorite thing I love to do. It can fatten up your sound. Used a bunch of sawtooth waves to create this sound. And I used the ADSR to add a little bit of attack. So you'll hear that attack come in, but when it's layered with the actual strings, you'll see the unique effect. So in this example, let's listen to just the orchestral mix where you'll hear orchestral percussion, brass ensemble, and string ensemble. And let's take a listen to that first, and then we'll move to the next one. So if you could play that, Dina, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Cool.
So pretty straightforward, right? Nothing super crazy going on there. But I wanted those strings to be a little bit fatter. And again, these are subtle. This is more of an example than a true use case, but I think it's an interesting application of how to use the 2600 in here. So what we're going to listen to now is just the 2600. I'll address the polyphony issue in a minute, but super underwhelming, right? It's classic, cheesy, analog synthesizer. But what you need to think about, I think about, is I am thinking less about, prominent sounds, really fat synthesizer stuff. What I'm trying to do is achieve movement and breath into my orchestral sample. So if we can, let's take a listen to the extremely underwhelming string layer.
Okay.
So again, underwhelming in and of itself, but again, understanding what we're trying to accomplish here. You'll hear when we play the next example, which is the 2600, that string part and the orchestral samples, and hopefully you can hear it through the computer, but you'll hear a little more depth, a little more breath, and really what it does is it creates the illusion of more of a live sound. From an orchestral sample. So if we can, Dina, let's take a listen to the 2600 and the string mix. So again, hard potentially to hear over the computer, but it gives us the opportunity to add that illusion of live musicians. It gets the string sample to behave in a little bit different way than it would if it was just the string sample. So let's take a listen to the full mix so we can hear kind of what the end result would be. And again, the thing to keep in mind, at least what I keep in mind, is these are very subtle type things. Like I said, the first example was more in your face, and certainly the 2600 is fantastic for that. But I think the art of using synthesizers in visual media scoring can sometimes be in the subtle and sublime more so than in your face. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. I've done a bazillion cues that the 2600 or the Moog Modular are, in your face. I mean, I think of other composers like Tom Hockenberg and Hans and others that have used the 2600 that way. But I think what's really cool is getting into the subtle space of doing that. So if we can, Dina, let's take a listen to kind of all of it together.
All right. Wow, what a difference. Yeah. Before we go any further, I do want to say that we're getting some questions that seem really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah. So is this a good time to?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a question.
Right.
Hopefully I got some.
All right. So the first question is from Sintel, and he asks if you use it, I'm assuming the 2600, for processing external sounds or purely as a sound source in itself.
Great question. So I would say 99.5% for me is a sound source. I have in the past, used it to filter things and that type of thing. But to be honest with you, I use it primarily as a sound source. The interesting thing is, as a composer for film and television, my world is radically different than it is when I'm Dave the musician. For me, I've got to do things very quickly. I've got to turn music around quickly. I don't have a lot of time to necessarily experiment with the things that I'd love to experiment with. Usually I've got to turn something around. I've got a deadline. So the short answer to your question is most of the time I'm using the 2600 as a sound generator and not as a processor. But I love the question because that's a whole nother topic of really cool sonic possibilities. So a great question.
All right. We have another one. Thank you for that, by the way. Let's see if I can get the... somehow I'm not getting it on the broadcast, but Joe Gushin asks, how are you patching to thicken the string samples? How are you patching to thicken the strings samples?
So patching, I'm assuming like how did I do this type of thing. I mean, it's very simple. Let me back up. One of the things I think is really important as a synthesizer programmer, and certainly as a musician, and as even more so as a composer, is you need to understand what your waveforms sound like. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, people are just dialing stuff up, and that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But if I have a use case that I know that I need to create a certain sound, or equally important, I know that my cue has unique sounds in it, then I need to be cognizant of the sounds that I'm creating with the 2600. What I mean by that is if I've got something that's heavy with woodwinds, I might want to stay away from square waves and sounds that have square waves because they sound very reedy and woodwind-like. Because then my synth might get buried in the mix and just may not work what I'm looking for, unless I'm trying to double something, right? So in this case, I'm doubling the strings. So using sawtooths, using 3 oscillators, detuning them, playing with the filter just to give it, again, a little bit thinner, right? What I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to thicken from the perspective of, cellos, violas, that kind of thing, but I'm trying to give movement and just a little bit of breathing. So, my transposition on my oscillators are probably going to be somewhere around 4 or 8. I'm going to have, my filters open pretty wide to give me that thinner sound, and then I'm going to detune those oscillators to thicken it up at a high level. So those are things, that I guess you get used to. You start to become natural with it. But I would, if I were to give anyone a piece of advice, try to understand what your waveforms sound like, because they can really help you narrow down the types of sounds. So I'll give you another example. I just played on a good friend of mine, amazing drummer. He's got a new jazz fusion, Latin jazz album coming out. I used the 2600 pretty heavily, but my composer mind started thinking like, all right, in one of these cues or tracks on the album, I'm really the lead instrument on there. So the thing I thought about was, okay, I can use sawtooths, I can use pulse width modulation, I can use synced oscillator type lead sounds because I'm the only lead instrument on the track. But then there was another track that had sax and some other reed instruments. So I'm like, well, I'm going to stay away from square waves and that type of thing, because then they start getting lost. They don't stand out. So again, it's a matter of, and I don't want you to sit there and think that, oh man, that's all I do, sit there and contemplate, and I'm not that calculating. It becomes natural after a while, but these are things I just, you think about, because if you know what your waveforms sound like, then you know how to make certain sounds. You know that brass and strings come from sawtooths. You know that reed instruments come from square waves. You know that pianos and bells come from triangle and sine waves. So again, you don't have to be a great synthesizer programmer, but if you know those fundamental basics, it's going to point you in those directions a lot easier. So I don't know if that truly answered the question, but I hope it did. It was a great question.
Cool. So I'm going to ask, would anyone else like to ask a question right now? We have a lot of wonderful emojis kind of popping up.
Hopefully they're good ones.
If not, what we could do is we could do one more. I really love this last. This is actually my favorite demo.
Awesome.
Yeah, it really, to me, demonstrates exactly what you're talking about now, actually. So unless there's another question, all right, let's go for this, and hopefully this sparks some interest. So this is the fanfare, what you call?
Yeah, so this is just, again, a very full fanfare type cue. With some octaves. So, Dean, if we could play that first one,
Whoops,
that'd be great.
I slipped. That's a big sound.
Yeah, I mean, and many of these cues could probably live on their own, right? So that's where you get into risk reward. Do you want to put that much effort into doing it? But I think it pays off if you do that, and you take that time. You can bring that cue to life a little bit more. So I want you to listen to just the orchestral brass, right? It's great samples. I'm not going to mention the brand, but I'm a huge fan. Great sample libraries. But take a listen to just the brass, and this is important because this gives us our reference point to what it's going to sound like with the 2600. So if you could play that, Tina, that'd be cool.
Sure.
Okay, so that's our orchestral kind of brass ensemble. So now what we're going to do is listen to the 2600, right? So again, underwhelming in and of itself because it's very thin by design. It's all generally in the same transposition range. So I think they're all at 4 octaves. It's 3 oscillators, detuned. I think I've got some reverb on there, a little bit of chorus, just to, again, add some fatness. But what you'll hear is a very long attack and some interesting detuning effects, right? Again, these are all very subtle. Unless you're listening for them, you probably wouldn't, really hear it. But they're by design. What I'm trying to accomplish is to give static brass samples, right, that have their own attack, but they all happen at the same time. I want the 2600 to give me that unique breathing effect of the brass with a little bit of crescendo, a little more breath coming out of it. So let's take a listen to that, the orchestra and the 2600 brass, and then we'll go to that one here.
Okay.
Right, not overly impressive, sounds, but what they do is give us that illusion that maybe perhaps these aren't samples, right, when you hear it in a full cue. So if we could play the next one, Dina, I think it'll give us, a bit of what this sounds like combined as their samples, okay, and that 2600. Right, so again, we're talking about very subtle usage of how we can put this together. So when we put it together with a full mix, it just helps create that illusion that maybe these aren't samples. And that's really what we're trying to do here in this example. So Dina, if you could go ahead and play that.
So this is the full, everything together.
Full mix, yep. Full orchestra and 2600. So of these 3 examples, we heard an overt, in-your-face, classic analog sound. Then we got into the more subtle things. And what I wanted to convey here, conceptually, is the 2600 is capable of being more than just what we typically think, right? Bass sounds, lead sounds, sample and hold. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But as a composer for film and television, I look at the 2600 as an extremely valuable piece of my sonic palette. And I can go overt, in your face, analog, classic analog sound, but I can also do some really cool, subtle things that you would never know the 2600 was in the mix, but it helped elevate my samples, right? And I could give you example after example where I've doubled woodwinds with the 2600, just to, again, add a little bit of depth, right? And it's all about how do I make this sound more realistic, particularly if I'm using orchestral samples. But if I am doing things that are more in line with the sequenced basses, the sample and holds, those kind of effects, the 2600 is phenomenal. I mean, it an amazing instrument, and I encourage anyone who has one, whether it's virtual, real, clone, don't be lazy. Like, this thing can actually produce amazing sounds and textures that you can use in your music that I don't see a lot of other musicians and composers doing. And maybe that's because it's, complicated, or it looks complicated to use, but it's really not if you understand some of those basic fundamentals. Do you want to go ahead, Dina?
Yeah, we have a question that actually is somewhat related to what you were just mentioning, and you had said you were going to touch upon this a little later, and this is about the issue of polyphony. So Synth asks, how are you accomplishing the 2600 polyphony? Multitracking via 2600 VST like Time Warp or Arturia?
Fantastic question. Well, the short answer is Arturia VST, and I'll explain why. As Dina mentioned, I've been playing ARP synthesizers since I was 4 years old. I was blessed to have 2600s, Odysseys, Pro Soloists, in my basement because of my dad. So for me, there's something very comfortable. It's part of my family. It's it's very sentimental to me to touch, feel, play, program, work with a real 2600. The challenge that has come about is, in my world as a television and film composer, you have to turn things around very quickly, and I don't have a lot of time to pull out the 2600, plug it in, try to sync it, tune it. My life doesn't, I don't have time for that in my life cycle of how I create music. So along came VSTs, and the Way Out Where product was a great product. Dave Mash turned me onto it. I loved it, great product, but Arturia came out with theirs, and I got to be honest with you, I'm a huge, huge fan of Arturia products. Not only do their VST, in my opinion, do their analog VSTs sound great, they work great, but more importantly, in my, again, workflow and life cycle of how I do things, the fact that I can have patch memory on a 2600, I can have patch memory on a Moog Modular or whatever it is I'm doing. The fact that I don't have to work to have my sample and hold or sequenced pattern tempo sync to a cue that may have 4 or 5 different tempo changes in the cue. It just, in my world of what I do now, it just makes my life so much easier, and it sounds fantastic. In fact, Dina, we talked about the patch book earlier. One of the things that I did was I took all my own custom patches that were handwritten over the years, and then obviously the ones my dad did and the ones that were in the original ARP patch book, and I started converting them into the Arturia stuff, and now my life is so much easier from a programming standpoint, and it sounds phenomenal. I mean, I'm a huge, huge fan of their stuff. They've got great sound, programmers and sample or synth programmers. So even stuff out of the box is fantastic. So I highly recommend it. But the short answer to your question, the polyphony, in this case, I'm using the VST, which is another added benefit of the VST is, as you know, the 2600 is, essentially monophonic. With a VST, I can accomplish polyphony and all kinds of fun stuff. So hopefully that answers that question.
So I have a question pertaining to using a VST. Coming from a background where you were hands-on with analog, do you find that understanding subtractive synthesis is easier once you've had your hands on an analog to translate that into a VST? Or can someone actually get a clear sense of subtractive synthesis through learning through a VST? Because I think that in my mind's eye, if you don't know the first, if you don't understand the signal flow and all that, that you could just put on a few patches, but you may not have the same kind of understanding. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's a really good question. I guess it's hard for me to answer it because I grew up very tactily. I was able to touch and feel and play these things and experiment. And what happens if I take this patch cord and I plug it in here? Does it something? I'm 8 years old, and I'm 7, 8, 9 years old. So it was more of an experimental type of thing versus, oh, this is what an oscillator does, and this is what a filter does, and this is what an ADSR does. But as I got older and started understanding and learning about, subtractive synthesis and how it works and filters and the whole 9 yards, I think, again, and this is just my experience, being able to touch and feel was more beneficial to me versus virtual. But that's me. Now, there may be other people where they've grown up and their whole world has been virtual. And it's not an issue for them to do that because the components are the same, right? I mean, you still have 3 oscillators, you still have your same filters, you still have all the same stuff. It's just virtual. So I think it's individual what your learning style is. But I always personally, let me give it. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but it's kind of analogous to using a flight simulator on your computer versus getting behind an actual wheel on an airplane and grabbing the stick and flying. Again, maybe not the best analogy, but I like that tactile thing, and I do miss that. As a musician, I miss that. I miss being able to play that way. And if I were live like I used to do and doing gigs, without a doubt, I'd want the real thing. But workflow, the virtual works much better for me.
Okay. We have another question. This is from Mark Hall. He says, I'm working with a composer on a feature doc project set in the 70s. We're trying to use vintage synths from the era and attempting to avoid software. Will the ARP 2600 sound too thin or odd to a modern audience? What's the best way to locate a working original 2600? And are the Korg 2600 clones a good alternative? Thanks. And Mark, please, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
Yeah.
as we're trying to amass a collection for the foundation. So locating original synthesizers is an interesting journey.
Yeah. So let me answer your question a couple ways because there were definitely a couple questions in there. So the first part is, do I think the 2600 will sound too thin for modern audiences? I don't think so at all. I think, you're dealing with at least modern audiences. They're used to hip hop, they're used to EDM. So I think their ear is attuned to analog, and, the older, in some cases, the older the sound it is, the hipper it is in some cases. So I don't know I don't think that's going to be an issue. And I think if your composer or sound designer or programmer knows what they're doing, I think the 2600 is one of the most fattest sounding synthesizers out there. So I wouldn't worry about that. I think, you'll be okay with that. As far as finding a used 2600, they're available, but it's going to set you back anywhere between $8,000 to $20,000 to get an original. If you're looking for just for the film, you might be able to rent one. I know of some places that rent them, so that may be an option for you. So it just depends. Like if you want it to actually be in a scene and you want a physical unit, that's great. Probably renting is better than buying because they're going to set you back a lot. The other question, which was the Korg. So the interesting thing, over the years is, we've had VSTs, we've had clones. I think it was TTSH made just a phenomenal clone that sounds amazing, like an original. Arturia has the VST. Way Out Where has their one, and then Korg came out with theirs, which, I saw it. I didn't get to actually make noise out of it, but I got to play it. It looks great, feels great. I imagine it sounds great. Probably impossible to find, from what I understand. They're sold out, and I don't know, what Korg's plans are on making more of them. But if you can get them, I understand they're pretty cool. I know Behringer's coming out with one. It won't look like the 2600, but I imagine it'll sound pretty cool for the money. So hopefully that answers your questions.
So
that question.
I do want to just, on my own experience, I found that it felt very much like an original 2600 when I played it. I don't have near the experience that you do, or that most of you there have, as far as truly handling a 2600, but it felt authentic. It had some amazing sounds, and I thought it was pretty awesome. There's also a company in Spain called Antinous, and they are a boutique size company that make 2600s as well, and I've heard wonderful things about them.
Yeah, I mean, there's some good stuff out there. It's just, I think it's like anything, right? It comes down to price point, availability, and use case. And, for a lot of people, the Bear is probably going to be a great opportunity for them to get their hands on a 2600. If you can get a Korg, that's a great product. If you can get an older one, there's plus and minuses to that as well. So, but look, generally speaking, and I think Dina would agree with me on this, the more people using ARP-centric synthesizers, I think, benefits us all. And I think that's awesome. So, good is a great question, though.
So Glenn Harlock has a question, and he says, I can see some mods on your 2600. Can you describe what they are? He's looking at the...
Oh, yeah. No, that's just a background picture. That's not my actual 2600.
Okay.
Thank you for noticing.
Okay, all right. So we're winding down. If anyone has any other questions, this would be a great time. I'm also going to supply, at the end of this presentation, there will be some links to David's websites. And I'll also, when I repost this to YouTube, I will also link to David's websites. We have some other questions. This is great. All right, hold on. Let me add this to the broadcast. Okay, so Amor Amezcua, I hope I said that correctly. What would be a recommendation to someone barely starting with a 2600 and soundtracks?
So recommendation, I guess, into what? I guess I would say...
How to learn, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I would look at it and interpret your question is this. Think of your 2600, it's analogous to being a painter or a chef, right? If you're a painter, you have a palette of colors, you have different types of brushes. If you're a chef, you've got spices and different ingredients. It's the same thing as a composer, right? We've got the instruments of the orchestra, we've got, popular instruments, and then we've got our synthesizers. Well, the 2600 is a unique shade, a unique color. I can use it as a broad fan brush. I can use it as a detailed brush. So what I would say to you as a composer is don't just go with the easy stuff. And what I mean by that is the classic analog sounds, the sample and hold, the sequenced patterns that you see everybody do. Those are all cool. And again, I'm not bashing that. But that's lazy, in my opinion. I don't mean to bash it from a creative standpoint, but everybody does that, right? You've got something that can do some really cool things. So I'd like you to think outside the box. I'd like you to think, how can I create unique textures, unique sounds that bring whatever it is you're writing, whatever you're trying to convey musically to life? And it doesn't have to be, a synced oscillator. that's super fat with pulse width modulation and all the other crazy stuff. It could be a single oscillator that has a unique, delicate attack with LFO. I mean, it's endless. So think broadly about how you can use it. I mean, there's always a place or time and place for sample and hold and really cool, filter effects. I mean, that's. I'm not bashing that. I'm just saying I'd like people to think a little bit more outside the box on how to use this instrument, because it truly is an instrument. And the other thing I would tell you, if you're just getting started, is learn about what your waveforms are. I can't stress that enough, because that will tell you what you need to know about certain characteristics of an instrument. And what I mean is, or what I'm trying to say is that if you know what a square wave sounds like, then you know it's a reedy sounding instrument, right? And I could give you an example, like, if we go really classic synthesizer, I think about Lyle Mays from Pat Metheny Group. I mean, his classic sound is that square wave, lead sound. That screams square wave to me. Mm-hmm. But you hear like brass sounds and lead sounds, well, those are going to be sawtooth waves. So know what these waveforms sound like, because that's going to help you. If you know that, hey, I want to create a brass sounding sound or a string sound, well, I need to use sawtooths to create that, right? If I want reedy sounds, I'm going to use a square wave. If I want piano and bells, I want sine wave and triangle waves. So just being familiar with that is going to be really helpful. And then the other things that I'm a huge fan of, and I do it all the time, is, I love detuning oscillators. I think that fattens up sound. I'm not a fan of single oscillator sounds. I just that's not appealing to me sonically. I like fat sounding synthesizers, and so play with the tuning. I'm always recommending people, if you're using 2 or 3 oscillators, detune them a little bit, fatten them up, tune one of them to a 5th or a 9th or a 7th. Things like that. Again, you don't have to be, some amazing super synthesizer programmer, but if you know what some of these basic things do, then you can start incorporating them, right? And then you can start creating some really interesting textures, and then you can build from that, right? I think those are some easy things you could do.
So would you say that for someone who's just learning about synthesis, the waveforms are really like the alphabet in a way?
I think so. I think so, because I think that's where everything starts, right? I mean, that's where everything starts, and then everything else is. Imagine it if you were to sculpt something, right? Your waveforms or whatever you're creating is what you're sculpting, right? Now your filters, your ADSR, your LFO, those are all fine refinements and things you're going to chisel away here and chisel away there to sculpt whatever that sound is.
That's a great analogy.
So getting familiar, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, but just knowing sonically what these things sound like will help you identify, or at least if you know I want this kind of sound or that kind of sound, now you know where to start. And that's half the battle, is knowing where to start. And look, last NAMM, Dina, you and I were there, and I went over to the 2600 at the Korg booth, and honestly, I'm watching people interact with this thing, and you would have thought a UFO had landed and spilled out alien hieroglyphs the way people were looking at it. They just had no clue. And it's like, I get it. It can be intimidating, but starting out, I think those are the key things. And there's so many resources out there. I mean, a simple Google search, can help you, kind of learn some of these basics of subtractive synthesis. The only thing I would caution is don't get confused. Some synthesizers have AR, some have ADSR, some have, cutoff frequency and Q. They all essentially do the same thing. I guess my last piece of advice on that question would be, I'm an intuitive guy. I learn, I compose, I I do what I do intuitively. There's composers that will sit there and think, okay, I'm going to use this mode. I'm going to go circle of fifths. I'm going to do a 1-4-5 chord progression, whatever. Right? I can't. That's not how my brain works. I'm very intuitive. I just start doing things, and then hopefully it ends up sounding, not bad. And I would say the same thing from a programming standpoint. Be intuitive, experiment, explore. And you'll start to figure it out. You'll start to say, oh, well, this does that. Okay, that's interesting. And that just comes with use. But understanding those basics, just knowing what some of those things sound like, I think will be helpful, at least from my experience.
I just want to share a few comments because I think they're really appropriate, especially with what Mike Hollett asked about the original 2600. So Than Silverlight, it says, the lack of stability was part of the beauty of early analog. And Mike Hunter adds, a little chaos is a good thing. And it brings me back, your analogy about visual arts, which is the medium that I studied mostly, as opposed to music, which I did study some. It's a great analogy, but some of the greatest things that happen are what you would call a happy accident, which is like thinking outside of the box. So one's ability to be curious and experiment, I think, is what you're saying, and I really find that is sort of the key to discovery. Just being open.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the magical thing about synthesizers, right? Is I remember when I was a kid, and again, I was blessed in that I had 20 synthesizers in our studio, and I would sit there, I'd turn the lights down low, and I'd just start, run over here, blah, 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 make some weird stuff, and that would start going, and I'd run over to this, and and as a kid, I would spend hours just coming up with like musical worlds of, and it really, I remember, I was thinking about this the other day. I thought about, when Rick Wakeman did Journey to the Center of the Earth and how it told this whole story and musically. And so, as a kid, I was listening to that and it's like, oh, it's super cool. And I'd go down into our studio and that's the whole thing. That journey of discovery sonically is so important, right? Because you're not going to, unless you start doing weird stuff and throwing things into it, and you're not going to break it, and there's no right or wrong way to do what we do. So explore, try different things. You may find something that's super cool and you're in good shape. So anyway, that's how I agree with you.
So Jeff Kellum says, and I was going to mention this, that my father was a co-author of a book, and I know your father actually wrote one of these books as well. Forgive me, did he also was involved with learning music with synthesizers?
I believe he was, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a great resource. It really breaks it down to nuts and bolts, pun not intended. But yeah, there's some great literature out there, and we're constantly trying to update our resources. And if it seems like it's in demand, I'm happy to link some resources also to some basic synthesis instructions, whether it's YouTube or books that are out there. But it seems like that this is something that would be really beneficial for everyone. And so,
well, and Dina, shameless promotion warning. I mean, look, if you're looking to know how to program certain sounds, I mean, I've put together this amazing resource. It's got a lot of ARP history in it that I got from my dad and other resources and stuff that I've had. It's got the original ARP patch book in it. It's got a bunch of VIP patches that were never given out. And it's got a bunch of my custom patches in there as well. So it's a great resource for people who maybe don't know how to program yet. Where you just you can download it, get it, use it, and you've got a whole resource of sounds to use. So again, it's just another resource out there. There's a million of them. Explore them all.
All right, so we're gonna we're kind of a little bit over, so we're gonna end right now. I know that if you want to just briefly go over those last talking points, and we'll close. Let me go ahead and grab them.
Yeah, so let's talk about some. I guess what I things I would consider when using the 2600 in general, but sort of visual media scoring. You know, your 2600 can, you know, do all kinds of cool stuff. Fatten up cue, add drama with the sample and hold, you know, create unique sonic palettes, double and layer sounds. You can think outside the box, detuning your oscillators. Those are all cool stuff. But what I want to do is leave you with best practices. So these are some things that I'd like to think are common sense, but certainly apply to real 2600s and virtually any other older vintage analog synth, right? So technical best practices. Keep your power clean, right? No 60 cycle hums. Engineers hate that, especially if you recorded something and there's a 60 cycle hum that got printed. You're going to have some angry engineers. So try to keep your power clean. You know, again, vintage analog synthesizers, they're old, they get dirty, they got sliders, they got pots, right? Keep them clean, right? If they make noise, that's a problem, right? We want noise out of the signal path. Let your synthesizer warm up. ARPs are the best of the vintage analog synthesizers that stay in tune, right? And there's reasons with the oscillators being put in epoxy, and we can get into the whole history of that at another time. But you still got to let it warm up. Let your synthesizer warm up before you tune it, right? Otherwise, the oscillators won't stable, and then your synth will keep going in and out of tune. It'll be a pain in the ass. Use good quality cables, right? Crappy cables make noise. And you can see here that I keep repeating issues around noise, because when you're dealing with vintage analog synthesizers, they're generally noisy. So you want to do what you can to minimize that noise. Unless, and of course, you're using a VST, a Korg clone. The other clones, you know, that are more modern, then they're going to be less noisier than the kind of vintage ones. Tune your synthesizer to A440 using a single oscillator first. Then you can tune the rest of the oscillators, but only after what?
It's been warmed
your synthesizer is warmed up, right? Otherwise, it'll drift and then everything will be out of tune. So again, single oscillator, A440, then you can add your other oscillators after everything's warmed up and a little more stable. Tune again before you record or perform. Analog synths typically like to drift, right? So nobody likes out-of-tune musicians. If you're dealing with vintage stuff, just keep it up. You know, get it serviced. There's a lot of greats out there that service analog and vintage analog synthesizers. It's not cheap, but you know, these things are you know, getting to the point of being priceless in many cases. So you don't want it to crap out in the middle of a project, and you certainly don't want them to break on you. Also, if you're recording something and you're using the spring reverb on the 2600, be careful to not jolt it, because you'll get these weird thunder sounds because of the spring reverb in the 20. I've had that happen a couple of times, and it drove me nuts to figure out where the hell that sound came from. But so those are technical best practices. Let's talk about performance best practices. Again, high-level things that I like to do, and I always recommend. For me, more oscillators, the better. I love detuning oscillators, creating really fat sounds. But not only, you know, can you create fat sounds, but if you're careful in how you detune these with fine tuning, you know, you can create some really interesting spatial movement with your oscillators. So it creates almost like an auto panning type of effect. Very cool. Play with them. I love doing that. It's one of my favorite things. You know, try tuning your oscillators at different transposition ranges, right? 8, 16, 32, oscillator 1 at 8, oscillator 2 at whatever. It creates, again, unique space in the sound that you're creating. Mix your waveforms. Like I said, sometimes mixing sawtooth with pulse width, you get some really interesting effects. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Understanding what your waveforms sound like, I think, is really important. Be careful when layering or doubling 2600 analog sounds with live orchestra or sampled orchestra. You can get into some tuning issues, right? We talked about much earlier about when you have an ensemble playing and all these different people, there's minute differences. Well, when you start layering in synthesizers and analog sounds and you've detuned the oscillators, it can sound like things are a little bit out of tune. So just be careful with that, and maybe that's a fix where, in your mix, the analog stuff's a little bit lower, or maybe you don't detune them so much. Work with your LFO, right? Create some really neat vibrato effects. You can modulate your oscillators and your filters and do some really cool stuff there. So LFO is important. Try to get to know that and leverage that. I'm a big fan of Porto. It doesn't have to be on all the time. And again, it's big with lead sounds, but also bass sounds, right? I mean, just being able to slide up and you can create some interesting legato effects with, your bass and other type sounds. So I think that's pretty cool. If you're using VST or MIDI versions, layer them. One of my favorite things to do, and I do this often in my music, one of the greatest, combinations for me is a Moog modular and the ARP 2600. It just creates, not only is it super fat, but it's just cool. I love the way it sounds. So play around with that. Think of your 2600 to layer double orchestral parts, right? Just be careful of the tuning. And then what we talked about, Dina, have fun, right? This isn't prison. You're not being forced to do it. Don't be intimidated. The greatest thing about electronic music is your ability to explore and create new things. There is no one set way to do it, right? Everybody's way is different, and just go with what works for you and, create some cool sounds. So those would be my performance best practices.
Yeah, having fun, that's important. One of my favorite graphics that my dad made later in life, he liked to fool around with a lot of graphics, was saying, I hope you had as much fun playing this as I had making it. So,
Yeah.
I think having a curious mind is really the key to, I think, not just optimal synth playing, but to a lot more in life. I'm sorry we have to end this. This has been delightful. A lot of people just joined, and this will be downloaded and, I should say, uploaded to YouTube in a little while, probably later tonight or first thing in the morning. So you'll be able to go back if you haven't seen it. And I really thank you for helping us with our first mini masterclass. This has been terrific. We're going to end with one more piece, and at the end of the slide, there's some information about how you can get in touch with David if you're interested in what he does, and some information about the Eleanor Perlman Foundation. We are a not-for-profit. There's information about how to donate if you would like to donate to our foundation. Everything is tax deductible, as we are now an official 501c3, which has been a wonderful journey so far. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Really, really great to have all of you familiar faces out there, your familiar emojis, I should say. And stay safe, stay healthy, and talk to you all soon, I hope. All right.
Appreciate it, Dina.
Thank you both.